Do you feel like you have an idea that is highly dependent on your character's backstories, but you've heard all the arguments against including flashbacks in your story? Well, I'm here today to tell you how you can actually identify whether your story needs flashbacks and how you can find a calculated way of adding these in.
Welcome to the Plottery, where I teach writers just like you how to make storytelling become second nature.
Hi, I'm Shar. I'm a fiction writing coach. You might know me from The Plottery on Instagram. And today we're going to be tackling the subject of flashbacks. Flashbacks, the doom of newbie writers, the main source of info dumping, the lazy writing. You've heard all of it, right? Well, I'm here to tell you that this advice is highly outdated and you can definitely find ways to include flashbacks in your story if you so desire. You can still write an incredible and engaging story using flashbacks, and I actually, for one, am a massive fan of those. Now, the reason why I love flashbacks is because when they are done right, they tell you so much about characters that you could not have possibly gotten to know through context of whatever it is that you're reading or watching. Flashbacks can be a lovely way to dig into a little bit of extra story within your main plot. Flashbacks can be an awesome way to bring more plot lines and more questions into your story. And flashbacks can also be a way to answer some of those questions in your story too. Now, before we get into the wonders of flashbacks, I do want to take a second to talk about all the pitfalls of flashbacks first. There are genuinely times where using flashbacks is just a big no-no. And these are usually times when you use flashbacks for info dumping. This is something you should actively avoid. You should definitely not go into a flashback directly after describing the event that you are about to go into, because that way you're kind of doing it twice. You don't need to give us a rundown of what happened or a hint in the dialogue of something that happened to this character and then go directly into that exact flashback to tell us more about it. Sometimes one or the other is enough, but definitely never do both. Flashbacks in books have a tendency of feeling like you're just trying to dump information onto your readers. Oftentimes, these flashbacks will be there to answer questions that you posed maybe in your main storyline. But the way to avoid this is to actually think of a way that you can still set up some questions throughout your flashbacks. So you're not necessarily only answering what's happening in the main story, but you're also asking new questions or opening new possibilities and giving us a deeper look into that character and what it is exactly in their backstory that should interest us and what it is that might actually draw more questions rather than giving us the answers. Another thing you want to avoid in your flashbacks is giving away too much information. Your reader didn't ask for this flashback. Your reader didn't ask for this information. So make sure that when you are giving them a flashback, you are making it worth their while. This kind of ties back into me saying that your flashbacks shouldn't just be answers, they should also be questions. Moving on, do not repeat things that your character has already expressed in your main timeline. So again, if your character has spoken about this event that happened in their past and they've actually already told someone all about it, there is absolutely no reason to then also have a flashback to that event. Whether that flashback is later on or not doesn't matter. If your reader is already aware of all of this, you don't need to include the flashback. You can, however, include a part of the flashback that we weren't aware of. You can include a part of that same event that the character didn't tell us about. If it's a missing piece of information, if it's something new, something that we didn't know about, that's when you are definitely allowed to go into a flashback and give us that missing piece of the puzzle. And finally, the one thing that you should avoid when writing flashbacks is having only one or two flashbacks in your book just for the sake of having them because you didn't know how to find a better way to slot that information in your present timeline. Now, sometimes having only a few flashbacks can be very effective if this is the thing that you're going for, if there is a reason behind it, if it's something that matters for your project. But just having flashbacks because you can't find a better way to express it in your story is not an excuse to use flashbacks. Flashbacks should be planned into your story. Flashbacks should be there for a reason. They should be there because you need them to be there and because there is a certain purpose behind why you put them there. But using only one or two in the entire book can feel very out of place, especially if your book is only focused on one narrative position and suddenly you are in a completely different time and space, maybe even a different narrative perspective. Your reader's gonna feel very thrown off if you do that to them. All right, now let's talk about how you can actually pull off flashbacks. Now, the first thing that I want you to be aware of when you're writing your flashbacks is that you know the difference between giving context in a present time scene and going into a full-on flashback within your story. So what does this mean? When you are giving context throughout a scene that is currently happening in your story, that means that potentially what you're doing is, yes, there is some kind of dialogue going on at the moment, but your character may have a bit of an internal reflection to something that happened to them before, something that they have experienced, which has somehow been prompted by a feeling or a sentence or something that they are experiencing in the current situation. So your character might be having a conversation with someone about ice cream, and they might fleetingly remember a very important moment to them that they experienced with their mother or something when they were 10 years old at the beach. And you can slot that into the paragraph, and you don't have to go into a full-on explanation or a full-on scene within the current present scene. You can just kind of use their internal monologue, their internal narration to describe what it is that they are reminded of in that moment. So sometimes you don't actually have to go into a full-on scene. You can just describe some of the context within your current scene, within the description. You don't necessarily have to go away into a different time and space to tell us all of this. You can definitely have sort of context interwoven flashbacks, if we want to call them that. Okay, so here are the main ways that I have compiled together for you today that you can create a really good flashback storyline. Number one is to create a narrative throughout your story in your flashbacks. So this is, again, kind of like Lost. That is what they did. Basically, every single episode had a present story, so whatever was happening on the island, and then they also had a complete storyline throughout their flashbacks. So what I mean by this is they would have about, I think it was 3 to 5 flashbacks per episode that focused on one specific character and one moment or event in their life, and it would be a complete finished story. So the first flashback would be the beginning of that important event of whatever happened in that character's life that kind of defined them and aided to this moment on the island that we are seeing in the main storyline. And the last flashback would be a conclusion to that story. And so I think this is probably the most effective way to use flashbacks, especially in a series. And if you are trying to expand on who your character is, or you want your readers to know a little bit more about them outside of the situation that they actually find themselves in within your main narrative. So when you are using flashbacks, think about how you can connect them with one another. Are they continuations of one another, or are they just random flashbacks? Because it can be so much stronger if you connect the flashbacks into a little story of their own that follows your main plot and is there to kind of support it and to give us a little bit more of an insight into your character and why they make the choices they make based on whatever happened in their backstory. Secondly, you can potentially do 2 storylines. So if you have a chunky backstory, which actually answers your story question, then you could potentially think about including that backstory as a second storyline, as like a subplot, as like a second narrative in your overall project. And following the same example from Lost, if you can disperse these flashbacks throughout your story and only give us the relevant pieces of information at the time when they are relevant, then what you're doing is actually avoiding info dumps and making it flow more naturally. And you're giving your flashback time to breathe. You're giving it time to form itself into a full-on narrative rather than just a device for you to info dump. Tip number 3 for pulling off flashbacks is to leave your bigger reveals for later on in the story. So what I mean by this is, don't write 2 chapters of your book and then in the 3rd chapter have a flashback that reveals the very worst moment of your character's life, because where do you go from there? Instead, what you want to do is you want to focus on foreshadowing this, letting this build up. Keep that big big, intense, climactic moment, that big change that occurred in your character until later chapters. You want to give us the actual big moment at a point in the story where it pays off. Maybe, say, somewhere in Act 3 of your novel, we've just witnessed a big emotional breakdown, a really serious, heavy loss for your character, or they've done something wrong, or something just really did not go the way they planned, or we as readers are in a moment where we hate them the most and we can't believe that they've just done what they've done. And if you give us this big reveal of whatever it was that happened to them in their backstory that made them this way, that led them to this point, to this emotional breakdown or to this emotional breakthrough, this is when it's going to mean so much more to us as readers when we find out what actually happened to them. You're going to have a much bigger impact on your readers if you allow that flashback storyline to build up over the course of your book until you actually reveal the big event that has been the mystery for the entirety of your story. Okay, I also have some tips and tricks for you on how you can make your flashbacks feel a little bit smoother when you are writing them. So number one, you want to parallel your flashbacks to your main story. And what I mean by this is that you want to have something similar going on between your flashback and between whatever it is that happens in the main story. So you don't want to just throw a flashback in there randomly at a random point in time. There has to be some reason that we are being given this information as readers right now, right in this point of time, because you must have said something in the main storyline that now prompts this flashback for us so that we learn a little bit more about something that is relevant to what is currently happening in your story. Number two, you want to connect them well using symbolism. So this can be anything from using the same objects, using the same situations, the same colors, the same characters, when you transition from a current scene into a flashback scene. Again, this is something that Lost does really, really well. They will have a zoom in on a certain object or a specific kind of shot that is going to then be mirrored in the other timeline as they transition through them. Now, obviously, because you're writing a book, this might be a little bit more difficult to do, but you can still achieve it with maybe using the same dialogue line to end one chapter and open another, or leaving off in the same location and then starting in the same location for the next chapter or the next scene. Or you could just mention an object in one scene and then transition into your other timeline and then mention that object again at the beginning of the scene. Tip number 3, use your main storyline to set up intrigue. So the more questions that you can ask, that you can set up about the backstory, about whatever is happening in the flashbacks in your main timeline, the more interesting it's going to be for your readers to actually read the flashbacks. And tip number 4, keep your flashbacks short and sweet. You don't want to let them take over your main project if that is not what they are there to do. Now, I would highly recommend watching my last video, which is all about how you can create a complex character and a killer backstory for that character. So if you are someone that is looking forward to using flashbacks in your story, that is a must-watch for you. Now, I hope you feel super enthused about using flashbacks and that you are not going to be appalled by all of that advice that tells you not to use them, because now you know how to use them. So you should go out and use them and write on, and I will see you on the flip side. Bye!